CPR has a bit of history with it, which is important to recognize. One of which is that if you had a cardiac arrest in 1970, by the way, what is a cardiac arrest? Cardiac stands for what? Heart, and arrest is what? Stop. So they are fundamentally what? If my heart stopped, what would I be? Dead. Good. It's really good. Oftentimes people are like, oh, they're having a heart attack. And I'm like, oh, no. The heart attack came before that. They're dead now. Okay? So in 1970, if you would have gone in to cardiac arrest and it was witnessed, you would have had a 7% chance of surviving it. 7% chance. Okay. The big problem is that we weren't actually teaching CPR for cardiac arrest. We were teaching CPR for drowning because more people were dying of drowning then. And ironically, more people die of cardiac arrest today. We should get back in the water, but I digress. So what we've got going on here is that you had a 7% chance of survival, which is incredibly low. And then in 1980s, and we started teaching CPR back in the 50s, but it wasn't until 1986 that we came up with a standard for education. Yeah, pre-hospital standard for education in 1986. Some of you aren't old enough to be alive for that, but most of you were. That's problematic to think about. There was no standard for pre-hospital medicine, meaning that the people that came and helped you in an ambulance, their level of training, as I like to refer to, is that they were pavement scrapers. They would scrape you off of the pavement, put you onto a gurney, load you into the ambulance, and get you to the hospital as quickly as possible. The level of training that you had was based on the area of the country that you were in. Meaning, if you were near Boston, if you were near Pittsburgh, if you were near Salt Lake, if you were near LA, you probably had a pretty good education. Why? Because there's research medical facilities there when they actually used to do research. We don't do research anymore, the pharmaceutical companies do. But I'll come back to that. And so in 1986, we created this pre-hospital standard, and then we started doing research on the standards that we were providing. And so for some of you, you've done CPR and you've said, is this going to change again? Meaning there was a period of time roughly between from 1998 until about 2015 where it changed every 3 to 4 years. And it was frustrating for people. The problem is we didn't know what we were doing. Thankfully, today, we have a pretty good standard that we've been holding on to for about the last 10 years now. We've changed some speed, we've changed some minor things, but in general, it stayed the same. Now, today, if you have a witnessed cardiac arrest, you have up to an 84% chance of survival. Now, that's possibility, that's not probability. Meaning, if everything goes absolutely right, 84% of the time we can have a save. But everything doesn't go right all the time. And here's why. Because the standard is a bit difficult to meet. So we call this the cardiac chain of survival. There's 5 components to it. The first 3 are hours. The last 2 are professional standard. And what it comes down to is that if we don't meet the first 3 components of this, well, it's going to be impossible to get to that 84% chance of survival. So what do we need to do? So one, we need to have a witnessed event. And so within the first minute of arrest, we want what we refer to as an early 911. So we want to call out. The next thing we want within the first minute of arrest is we want early compressions. Early compressions. Now what's important to recognize is that your heart, what does your heart create in your system? Does anybody know what it creates when it pumps? Well, the electrical activity actually causes it to pump. When it is pumping, anybody know what we call that? Put that thing on your arm. Pressure. Blood pressure, right? Yeah, exactly. So when you go into cardiac arrest, your pump stops and your blood pressure starts to drop. So the biggest problem in cardiac arrest is, or I should say, not necessarily with cardiac arrest, but with cardiac arrest and compressions, is that we cannot increase pressure with compressions. We can maintain it. So the sooner we can get on the chest of the individual and start beginning compressions, the higher we maintain blood pressure, which maintains perfusion, specifically getting blood up to the brain in order to provide oxygen. So this is very key. If you don't get on within the first minute, we start to see cellular death occurring, and then individuals have a harder time surviving. They're less likely to survive. Now, the next piece of this is that we need an early AED. Now, this is the automated external defibrillator. Now, bear with me here. We want an AED on the individual within 1 to 2 minutes of arrest. Now, I understand in Teton County this may be pretty difficult depending on where you're working, if you're working on the river or if you're working in a wilderness setting, etc. The point is this. This is most successful. We also know that individuals that get early compressions and we interrupt them as little as possible, they last longer. And so they have more of an opportunity. But in a perfect world, we want to get the AED on folks early. Now the AED, what is it? So the AED is 2 pads that stick to the chest. They've got cables that run back to the actual unit. The unit's battery powered. What does it do? Well, it puts about 330 joules of electricity into the individual if they're in what we refer to as ventricular fibrillation. What is ventricular fibrillation? Well, when the heart goes into cardiac arrest, it's an artifact of cardiac arrest, and it's somewhat unique because it only happens with heart disease. This doesn't happen with congenital issues. So if you're born with a congenital heart deficit, okay, the heart's not functioning properly, it's mechanical. When that heart stops, CPR doesn't work because the heart has a malfunction with it. In cardiac arrest, the heart is fine. It's the vessels that are clogging the blood to the heart. I hope you understand that in a bit. Now, when the heart goes into cardiac arrest, sometimes the nervous system is still intact. What does that mean, Jake? Well, what it means is this. A lot of you have been around animals when they've been killed. So specifically around a fish is probably the easiest one to think about, where it's like you've gutted it, you've taken the entrails out of it, and you're going to take the head off of the thing, and the thing jumps out of your hand. It's dead, right? But there's electricity in it. And the electricity is engaging with the nervous system and it's causing that muscle twitch. Well, that happens sometimes with the human body, except what it does is it causes one chamber in the heart to wobble. All the whole heart is stopped, but the electricity comes in and it makes the left ventricle wobble. If those pads can sense that wobble, which it's made to do, and so if it's wobbling, it will pick it up. And then it will say, stand clear, let's charge the battery up, and then hit the button when it says it. And we're going to put the electricity back into the heart with the intent of cardio-converting that wobble back into a beating heart. It's fascinating, okay? And basically, there's an AV node that manages the electrical impulses. And ultimately, there's a complete misfire that's gone on with the heart. And so it's an abnormal rhythm with electricity that it's incapable of turning into a beating heart on its own. And when we throw electricity into it, we can convert it back into a beating heart. Okay? Now, this is ideal. The reality of it is that if you're working in a wilderness situation, we need to be able to size up what happens before this, which is the heart attack, okay? Because if we can size up a heart attack, we can call 911 far before they go into cardiac arrest and get rescue services moving towards us. We can also treat a heart attack with some medication. We'll talk about that in a little bit, simple thing called aspirin. And so we'll focus on the majority of that. And then if we have to, then we're gonna move into the CPR skills. The other two pieces of the cardiac chain of survival move into what we refer to as early ALS, advanced life support. This is simply the ambulance. So this is within 6 to 10 minutes. So this is national call time nationwide in an urban environment. And so for instance, while we're not an urban environment, our call times are pretty good. You may not have an ambulance show up, but I'll guarantee you if you're in an urban environment, and when I say urban environment, I mean on a road, there's a good chance you're gonna have a first responder in this county get to you with an AED. It's probably gonna be a park ranger, a sheriff, a state police, could be an off-duty firefighter, could be an off-duty EMS, okay? And so those folks will get toned out ahead of the ambulance in an effort to get a trained responder to you earlier with resources. Because the ambulances are in specific places. The first responders are scattered throughout the valley. The last piece of this is what we refer to as definitive care. This is within 1 hour, and this is delivery to the emergency room. And so within 1 hour of the initial 911 call in the urban environment, this is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get folks to the ER within an hour's period of time. The other thing that's important to recognize is that we travel with, or I should say we rescue with helicopters in this valley. And depending on your location, sometimes they'll just deliver an AED to you with a helicopter depending on the location. Hence, being able to size up that heart attack becomes even more important, because the more extended the situation, the farther you're out, the less time that individual has. Okay? Questions, comments in regards to the cardiac chain of survival? Anybody?